Μπορούμε να περάσουμε στην δεύτερη ανακοίνωση.
We can now proceed with the second presentation by our colleague, recent Professor Todorovich, who started in Australia, the Department of Modern Greek Studies. But today he teaches at the Kapodistrian University of Athens, Department of Social Theology. His field of work is art. We owe him the image of the conference, and he will speak to us about the
expressing my sincere gratitude to the entire Ouresis Foundation, and more specifically to Professor Babignotti and Dr. Nikitsironi for this wonderful opportunity to present my work at such a high-level event. Also, by virtue of being one of the past scholarship recipients of the Ouresis Foundation, I feel most obliged and at the same time honored. Επίσης, ευχαριστώ όλους τους φίλους και συναδέλφους που ήρθαν σήμερα να παρακολουθήσουν την In my comprehensive study, which I will only concisely discuss today, I focus on the unfolded marble panels inside the interior of Hagia Sophia of Constantinople, and particularly on the way in which their selection and the concept of their installation may have been influenced by the mystical teachings of Dionysius, the Pseudo-Areopagite. And I might need to explain why I prefer the Pseudo-Areopagite to Pseudo-Dionysius later. I'm aware of the unusual stipulation of that name. Approximately a decade before Hagia Sophia was built, Dionysius' teachings were already assuming a rising influence in the thought of the church, as well as in the realm of the ecclesiastical arts. Bearing in mind the variety of previous approaches to the topic of marble panels, and also bearing in mind that the technique of unfolded marble panels is older than the Christian artistic tradition, my aim was to examine the possible ways in which the teachings of Dionysius the Pseudo-Areopagite regarding the infiltrating transcendental vision and divine darkness could have exercised an aesthetic kind of influence on the concept and process of cutting, selection, and installation of unfolded panels of colorful veined marble that decorated the interior of Hagia Sophia. Due to time limitations, I shall have to omit a number of important segments of the study, including the historical overview of relevant philosophical and patristic thought. I should only concisely point out that the term gnophos, which Dionysius uses for darkness in the context of transcendental vision, and which was used before him in a like manner by Gregory of Nyssa, is an antithetic term that actually means darkness of the light, gnophos to photos. More particularly, according to Dionysius, it is only by transcending the realm of logic that one can begin to experience God as light. Otherwise, he is experienced as darkness. Also, Dionysius teaches that this transcendental process of experiencing God as light is itself endless. In chapter 2 of Mystical Theology, Dionysius instructs that through not seeing, via avlepsias, and through not knowing, ke agnosias, we may arrive at the darkness which is beyond light, hyperphoton gnophon. In the continuation of that text, he uses an interesting metaphor by referring to the process of carving a marble statue, where the real emphasis is not so much on the statue, but rather on the process of removal of the excess material which hinders the path of one's, I quote, clear vision. In fact, as we shall see, when the text is read analytically, it becomes clear that the metaphor implies that the clear vision of the hidden, the katara tu krifiu thea, is in fact synonymous with the deducting process of carving or chiseling. The carving metaphor from Dionysius' second chapter of Mystical Theology reads as follows, quote, "We pray that we may come unto this gnophos, which is beyond light, and that through unseeing and through unknowing, we come to see and to know that which is above vision and knowledge, precisely through not seeing and through not knowing, because this, in fact, is the truthful seeing and knowing, and thus praise superessentially him who is superessential, by the abstraction of all things, like those who, making a self-existent statue, deduct all the surrounding material that hinders the vision of the concealed, and simply by that abstraction show the hidden beauty. The metaphor of carving is, of course, much older than Dionysius, and was employed in a relatively similar but not identical manner by Plotinus in the 3rd century. Thus, Dionysius' originality is not to be detected in the cited metaphor of carving itself, but in the particularity of the transcendental meaning that he ascribes to it. That is, in the idea of the anagogical, infiltrating, and transcendental vision, which implies seeing and experiencing that which is beyond vision and knowledge. The main quality of such a transcendental vision is seeing through things and seeing within things, or seeing the content of things which is otherwise unapproachable, and then arriving at a new state of unknowing or not seeing as at another level of ceaseless, ever-growing enlightenment. Accordingly, in the 2nd chapter of mystical theology, the adjective apokekrimenon, which means hidden, and which refers to the beauty of the metaphorical statue, and the adjective apokryptomenon, which also means hidden, and which refers to the superessential darkness, hyperousion gnophon, that, in Dionysius' words, is hidden by all the light that is in sensible things. Ton hypopandos tu entis ousi photos apokryptomenon. Both allude to the vision of that which is otherwise unapproachable by ordinary sight and understanding. As used by Dionysius, these adjectives also allude to something which is not a product of one's fantasy or imagination, but which exists regardless and independently of one's vision and understanding of it. This is explicitly implied in the carving metaphor mentioned above, where Dionysius says, quote, like those who, making a self-existent statue, and so on. More specifically, Dionysius uses the ancient Greek adjective αυτοφυές, which is composed of two words, αυτό and phione. The first word in this context means that, denoting a thing, a fact, or other phenomenon. And the second means I am begetting. Hence, the adjective αυτοφυές does not simply mean natural, but also bears the implication of self-existent and non-artificial. Most importantly, as I argued more extensively in my study, Dionysius ascribes to the experience of vision a bodily quality, where in a certain sense, vision is understood as an experience of the entire body. It is instructive that, just like Gregory of Nyssa, who in explaining what it means when it is said that Moses actually entered the gnophos, used the verb diadii, which means infiltrates. The related verb is dini, which also means infiltrates, is used in relation to Moses in a similar manner by Dionysius in the 1st chapter of mystical theology, where he says that Moses is ton gnophon tis agnosias is dini, infiltrates into the gnophos of unknowing. This concept of a bodily kind of infiltration into a sphere, which is normally off limits, could have inspired those who were in charge of cutting and selecting marble blocks and installing them thereafter as panels within Hagia Sophia. They could have reinvented this concept for it to be applicable to the cutting of solid marble blocks in a rather immediate way. In the 3 following slides, I have attempted to visually explain how the reinvention of Dionysius' idea of the infiltrating transcendental vision could have occurred in the process of producing unfolded marble panels. These images attempt to reconstruct the scene at one of the Proconnesian marble quarries. They depict a 6th century Byzantine viewer responsible for selecting marble slabs to be used, who in his contemplation of the unfolded stone, we're talking about the contemplation, the aesthetic one, he does the following. He goes through the stone in his contemplation, enters the stone, and finally infiltrates deep into the stone, which is the analogical stage at which the actual act of the transcendental vision commences, and where, metaphorically speaking, the viewer himself becomes identified with the self-existent, non-artificial statue, Astophies agalma, mentioned in Dionysius' carving metaphor, and thus becomes immersed in the divine darkness, which then is experienced by him as light. Thus, in the following slide, which is really a detail of one of the previous ones, we are presented with an image which aims at explaining how Dionysius' concept of vision, that, to use his terms, can carve or infiltrate its way through stone in order to embody its content and reach its hidden beauty, could have practically influenced those who were responsible for the entire process, from cutting and selecting to installing the marble panels in Hagia Sophia. More particularly, in this slide, we discern a human figure which stands between two freshly cut marble blocks, as if trying to envisage how it would be to see within the closed mass of the marble before it was cut. Accordingly, in the following slide, we see how the same human figure becomes absorbed into the colorful veins of the marble and thus becomes one with its own vision. More precisely, this image shows how the body of the 6th century Byzantine viewer transcends into vision itself, and thus can hardly be differentiated from it. Through the act of infiltrating transcendental vision, the body is absorbed by the beauty of the absolute other. This experience could also be formulated in the following way. Contemplating the uncreated and in his essence incomprehensible creator in view of the beauty of creation means truthful being and truthful seeing of the oneness and unity of everything. It should be noted that this experience of the viewer becoming vision itself, observed in the unfolded marble panels of Hagia Sophia, is reminiscent not only of Dionysius' teaching, but also, to an extent, of Plotinus' idea, as expressed in his own words. Quote, "If you see that this has happened to yourself, since you will become vision itself, having trust in your own self, without needing someone to show you, since you would have already ascended, focus your gaze and see, because only such an eye sees the great beauty." But despite the obvious similarities between Plotinus' and Dionysius' concepts of transcendental vision, once again, their differences become obvious when they elaborate on their ideas by relying on examples from the realm of art practices, and this is understandably of particular importance for the present topic. For example, in his text entitled Regarding the Noetic Beauty, Peri tu noitu calus, when Plotinus compares the two hypothetical adjacent stone masses, one untouched by the human hand and amorphous, and the other a statue of a god or of a man, he argues that, quote, "It is apparent that the stone in which the art has begotten a form is beautiful not because it is a stone, because in such a case any stone mass would be equally beautiful, but because of the kind of form or idea which was given to it by art." This stipulation by Plotinus allows us to understand that he does not speak of a kind of self-existent, non-artificial statue or beauty, Astophies agalma, of which Dionysius speaks 3 centuries later. This is one of the unfolded marble panels in Hagia Sophia. In contrast to Plotinus' concept of beauty, which is rather dependent on the practical execution of an idea, Dionysius' notion of the non-artificial beauty, which exists in matter even without human intervention, corresponds much more to the unfolded marble panels inside Hagia Sophia. For he says in the second chapter of Celestial Hierarchy, quote, "It is then permissible to depict forms which are not discordant to the celestial beings, even from portions of matter which are the least honorable, since matter also, having been granted its existence from the truly beautiful, has throughout the whole range of its material composure some echoes of the noetic reverence. And it is possible through these echoes to be anagogically led to the immaterial archetypes, under the condition that, as was said, similarities are understood dissimilarly and are not defined as identical. Thus the qualities should be understood in the harmonious and appropriate way concerning on the one hand the noetic and on the other the sensible beings." End of quote. In view of the possible influence of Dionysius' appreciation of raw matter, the unfolded marble panels in Hagia Sophia could be understood as examples of the exhibited beauty of raw matter, which of course is not self-existent, after Phias, in a self-created sense, but self-existent in a sense that it is created by God as beautiful even without further intervention. Thus, Dionysius gives us reasons to observe these marble panels as paradoxical natural icons created by God and revealed by man. After selecting the pieces to be cut into even panels and after bringing them from the quarry, this hidden beauty, apokekrimenon kalos, observed in the inner world of the veined marble, was then not only installed within the interior of the church, but was also superbly and vividly framed, as you can see. I have argued that the paired panels of marble were envisaged by their installers as a ready-made kind of an icon, or more precisely, as an icon which, through its aspect of minimal human intervention, becomes a natural icon which simultaneously refers to the mysteries of God, creation, and man, without necessarily depicting any of them formally. As seen in the following two slides, perhaps the most obvious indication that these pairs of marble panels were indeed envisaged as icons is the fact that most of them are deliberately and tastefully framed, either by narrow decorative frames or broader frames carved with vegetal ornament. Also, in the unfolded marble panels of St. Demetrius in Thessaloniki, which date back to the 7th century, as seen in the following slides, we observe a tendency to select those slabs of marble whose unfolding may produce a pattern reminiscent to an extent of human contours. Thus, in this particular example, we can almost discern the basic contours of human features. Because of their reminiscence of human form, the patterns in these marble panels in St. Demetrius may indicate to a continuation of the concept of infiltrating of the human figure into the stone, which was begun so authentically in Hagia Sophia and which was then lost in later centuries. Unfortunately, in today's presentation I had to omit the discussion of unfolded marble panels in other churches. And I'm referring to the 11th century Neamoni stihio in the island of Hio, and of course I'm referring to Osius Lukas and certain others, where we have the same concept, but we don't have the insistence on the symmetrical patterns. They are present, but there is fewer of them there. In summary, the main conclusion of my study is that the characteristically transcendental experience of vision observed in the unfolded panels of Hagia Sophia, in the unfolded marble panels of Hagia Sophia, is best understood as an entirely abstract and yet not necessarily non-representational Byzantine icon, which entails the cryptic and anagogical experience of the transcendental Byzantine body, and which is most probably inspired by the writings of Dionysius the Pseudo-Areopagite, as well as possibly by those of Gregory of Nyssa. It should be noted that the concept described previously, involving a bodily kind of infiltration into a normally unapproachable sphere, bears instructive resemblance to later Byzantine depictions of Moses taking off his sandals upon God's request in front of the burning bush. One characteristic example of such depictions is an early 13th century icon from Mount Sinai, shown on the right here, where Moses is shown taking his sandals off after hearing God saying, quote, "Take off your sandals, for the place where you are standing is holy ground." Thus, in my study, I also considered the possible influence of the 6th century unfolded marble panels in Hagia Sophia on other disciplines of Byzantine art. This can indicatively be observed, and I'm very sorry that we don't have enough time, and this is where it gets interesting. This can indicatively be observed in the following slide, where we see a detail of one of the cherubs from the pendentives of Hagia Sophia next to one of the unfolded marble panels. We can also perceive an influence these marble panels had on later examples of Byzantine art. When we look at the 14th century depiction of Transfiguration, on the right, where the symmetrical rendering of the mountainous landscape, as well as the repetition of the stripe-like rays of light which emanate from Christ, remind us of some of the symmetrical abstract patterns of unfolded marble panels in Hagia Sophia. Thank you very much.
Those who have a special affinity with the arts or knowledge of the arts are quite welcome to make remarks. Should there be any questions as well, you are quite welcome.
This is working.
It's working.
Thank you for an absolutely fascinating and completely original paper. It raises one question with me, which is a question of quite what sort of an influence Dionysius could have had. What kind of influence Dionysius could have had in the period which I suppose is between sort of 535 and 560. Because actually the reception of Dionysius in the Byzantine world is quite slow, and it mostly focuses on the letter where he uses the word "theandriki." And so I wonder if what you say is actually, I found very compelling, and I found myself wondering whether either Dionysius, this is actually evidence that we've not taken into account, and Dionysius was much more available than we thought he was, or whether Dionysius crystallized his ideas that were actually in the air anyway, partly from Neoplatonic sources and partly from Gregory of Nyssa. And so that we identify them in Dionysius because they're there very clearly, but they actually were there in the background anyway.
Yes, well, that question is part of the tremendous attention that I gave in formulating the paper, trying not to claim the inevitable existence of a concrete influence, but rather pointing out the parallels between a certain perception of what might be considered as a phenomenon where matter expresses the spiritual world or if you will, the material world. But to answer your question, there's two levels that I can answer, and one regards the chronology. And at that level, I would say that given that the first reference to the texts by Dionysius is in 519. Well, this is what most scholars agree, that this is the first reference to his text. And given that Hagia Sophia was built years later, there is a time there which allows for an influence to be developed. And then if we take into consideration, for example, Kissinger's view that even in the first decade, so to speak, after the appearance of the text by Dionysius, we already have an influence, particularly on the perception of an icon. And I'm referring to, well, I wouldn't like to quote the title of the work, but it's a very, very famous work by Kissinger. So there is a reason to believe, based on the chronology, that this could have happened hypothetically. But I agree with you that we should keep a certain, we should keep a stance which is objective, and we should not claim that there's an inevitable sort of, someone read the Dionysius texts and then went into cutting the marble. It's more of a mentality, and if you take into consideration that in the 6th century on the island of Plotinus, and I'm not sure, and no one is really, whether the library there, which was put by Justinianos I, whether it was in place in the convent that he built there years before building the Hagia Sophia, or later. But the very intellectual activity on that island, and the focus on the island where we have marble quarries, where you had people going for pilgrimage and other intellectuals, it was a center point of educated people in Byzantium. And so there is something there, and this is why I tried to be really careful in stipulating that. I don't know whether I answered the question.
No, thank you very much.
You're welcome.
I wish to thank you very much for this extremely interesting and insightful view in the background of the construction of Hagia Sophia.
Thank you.
May I offer you a conjecture concerning the question raised by Professor Lau? Most people, I think, agree that Dionysius, or Pseudo-Dionysius, was to some great extent influenced by the school of Proclus in Athens, who was active in Athens during the 5th century. Now, we happen to know that one of the architects who constructed the Hagia Sophia, namely Anthemius of Tralles, was a student of Proclus in Athens. So this possibly could provide an interesting link between what you have presented here and what we know from other sources. Thank you.
Of course, and not only that, but also facts such as that the Byzantines didn't use the term abstract for their art, nor did they have such distinctions as we do today in terms of this is architecture and this is art. So cutting the marble stones, given the lack of distinctions in the disciplines of Byzantine arts, allows for a certain very unassuming influence to filter in, again, that word filter in. And I claim, and this is partly an answer to Professor Lath as well, I claim that this influence is more likely to be a subconscious influence. We must sort of transfer ourselves to that era where the discussion of Dionysius' texts among the educated theologians were something integrated into the discussion of what is being built and how it is being built, and also people responsible for architectural solutions were also most likely informed of the most current and contemporaneous tendencies in theology. And I think that our contemporary perspective, which is full of discernment when it comes to the arts, is at points blinding us to understand that Byzantines were looking at the world holistically in everything.